In Twin Peaks, the moral dilemmas are not just dilemmas between good and evil or between faithfulness and faithlessness. They're also dilemmas between two different ideals of living, two different ways of organizing American society. With all this said, let's start to address the political evils of the town that are implied by the show. I'll continue to discuss this theme in various sections of this video, but I want to start with how the town of Twin Peaks exists as a culture, and how this culture helps spark a lot of the meaning and plot dynamics of the show. Much like in Blue Velvet, Twin Peaks is a show about a dichotomy between a dream world that we all willingly participate in, and the nightmares behind it that we are unwillingly haunted by. Twin Peaks exposes the seedy underbelly of its world by presenting itself with a nostalgic gloss. Blue Velvet provides a great jumping off point for talking about Twin Peaks, because Twin Peaks carries on from Blue Velvet in themes of critiquing 1950s nostalgia and its resurgence in the 1980s. I've already described this in my Blue Velvet video, so I'll refer you to that video for further context. Dale Cooper's entrance into Twin Peaks is an entrance into a different world altogether, as he describes when he says to Albert that Twin Peaks residents live a very different life in which a life is a life. Cooper also says in a different scene that he's whittling because that's what you do in a town where a yellow light still means slow down and not speed up. These two quotes are important to understanding the point of the show because they tie into the bigger themes nicely. Cooper is a quote-unquote city folk from Philadelphia, used to the hustle and bustle of a city life and a life in the FBI. This is far removed from the town of Twin Peaks, which is a far simpler, quieter, smaller town. The literal move from a big city to a small town also takes on a symbolic quality as it runs a bit counter to the hyper-industrialization of the 20th century. Remember that Eraserhead is set in a nightmare version of Philadelphia specifically, so you could almost see it as leaving from a world like that in Eraserhead, where the city is encroaching upon nature, to a more serene and mundane life in which nature is still a major piece of the town, even up to its name and its main industry of logging. Here in Twin Peaks, things are simpler. This is an element of nostalgia. Nostalgia for the days before postmodernity, before industrialization and globalization, back when a life is still a life, so to speak. But another quality is that Twin Peaks is a remarkably culturally backwards town too. Twin Peaks is stuck in a 1950s-esque culture, even though it literally takes place in the 1980s. The fashion, the cultural attitudes and values are very 50s. So then why does it matter that it feels like the 50s but set in the 80s? Because, and I'm going to list a few reasons right now, one, it has implications for the way in which Twin Peaks' simplicity might also lead to the dark side of Twin Peaks that we see throughout the show. Two, it is a bit of a political statement against contemporary nostalgia for 50s culture. And three, it's a meta-commentary on television and the many ways in which it could be seen as culturally backwards, especially in the wake of large developments in film as a medium through the 60s to the 80s. Ultimately, by being so quaint, Twin Peaks is capturing American culture in microcosm and, by contrasting the quaintness with somewhat extreme darkness, exposes the many flaws of America's relationship to media, family, violence, gender, community culture, and America's own role in perpetuating the darkness contained. Following from Blue Velvet, there's a reason why Twin Peaks, as a town and as a show, adopts a distinctly antiquated aesthetic, and specifically a 50s aesthetic. Because the 50s was, like I've said in previous videos, a time before massive movements for social change allowed for people of color, women, and LGBT people to make serious bids for better treatment in society. The 1980s and Reagan's economic policies and social conservatism brought with it a wave of nostalgia for the bygone era before women and people of color were forced to be reckoned with as equal citizens. The 1980s was a pushback against feminism and in favor of traditionalism, and as such, the traditionalism was reflected in a lot of film and especially TV of the time, as well as in the culture more generally. Lynch rejects 50s traditionalism while sharing a fondness for the ideals that it represents. This tension between the ideal of the 50s that he grew up with and the real-life 1950s and its serious social and political flaws is captured in Twin Peaks, as Laura's death allows us to see the nostalgia through the eyes of Dale Cooper as an audience surrogate, while also exposing both us and the town to these serious flaws. This is how Twin Peaks exists as a state of competing narratives. On the one hand, the 1950s represents for people in the 1980s a time of simplicity, traditional values of individual self-actualization, also known as the American dream, and an escape from the increasingly modernizing, industrializing, and corporatizing world. The 1950s represents a time when living in America did not mean living under the thumb of postmodernity and feeling suffocated by its effects. On the other hand, the 1950s represents a time of extreme suffering in order to keep up the appearance of perfect American idealism. It represents a time of great great misogyny, great power imbalances between men and women, and between white people and people of color. It represents a time of racism, of domestic abuse, of serious Cold War tensions. The 50s image was a front, obscuring a dark side just as it is in... So which version of the 1950s was real? Well, neither, but also both. These are just two ways of looking at the same truth. They're competing narratives of what the 1950s was, and they can exist simultaneously both in our minds and in the world itself. Twin Peaks is the town that represents these two competing narratives in their fully fleshed out form, manifested as literal people, at least for Dale Cooper. It's not about which version is the true Twin Peaks or which version is the true 1950s. They can both be true in some regards and false in others. What matters is, first, acknowledging the good parts and bad parts present in each, and second, recognizing the way in which the conflict between these two versions, these two competing narratives, can cause serious issues to become obfuscated. So let's start with the absolute most important element of the show, Laura Palmer. Laura is the whole point of the show, and without her, the show becomes somewhat meaningless. Lynch emphasized this time and again, always bringing Laura back into the picture throughout the original show and even into season 3, over 25 years after her death. Laura matters more than any. Simply put, her murder was an act of extreme, brutal misogyny. As I mentioned in my Blue Velvet video, patriarchal gender relations involve the exploitation of women for men's benefit. While we don't actually know who Laura's killer is at the start of the show, it's important to recognize that it's an act of misogyny, her murder. Her death is effectively an alternate reality in which Dorothy Valens never escaped Frank Booth. What if Jeffrey wasn't there? What if Jeffrey couldn't save Dorothy? She may very well have ended up dead on the shore, wrapped in plastic. Twin Peaks deliberately follows from Blue Velvet's meaning and starts in the aftermath of the potential reality that Dorothy narrowly escaped. As I said towards the end of my Blue Velvet video, the ending is actually rather dark by virtue of somewhat implying that the victory of her safety doesn't end the system of violence that made her unsafe in the first place. As such, there can still be a million other women and girls out there who are brutalized by patriarchal situations, even if one becomes free of it. If one woman is saved, this is still always a good thing, but there's no happy ending when under the thumb of an oppressive system. Laura's death is a bit of a spiritual successor. She's the other girl that didn't make it out. Imagine if, instead of finding Dorothy brutalized and alive on Jeffrey's front lawn, Jeffrey finds her dead on his front lawn. This is how Twin Peaks basically starts, except Jeffrey is now Dale, and Dale is already too late to save her. So like I said, it's an act of misogyny. This is important to understanding the show because the show is attempting to highlight the role that misogyny and patriarchy play in the construction of these two competing narratives about 50s culture and 80s nostalgia for it. Twin Peaks is a beautiful town where life still matters, but the town had to absolutely destroy a young woman's life and then end it in order to maintain this facade. Her death exposes the town for what it is, a town of brutal neglect and abuse. It's hard to cover this without bleeding into the themes of Fire Walk With Me, which I've saved for the next video, but it's worth noting that Fire Walk With Me helps substantiate these themes quite heavily. Laura's death signifies the absolute, irreversible dehumanization of women. She is the victim of patriarchal control resulting in its final state, the actual end of a woman entirely. Now let's talk briefly about existentialism. Existentialism is a philosophical theory that emerged in the 19th to 20th centuries. The basic idea behind existentialism is the notion of self-actualization. In the absence of God or faith, when one becomes aware of one's absolute mortality, one can either descend into nihilist pessimism or self-actualization. To self-actualize is to make life meaningful, to give life a purpose that makes it worth living. Existentialist philosophy predates postmodern theory, but it's very important to understanding both postmodern theory and feminist theory. After all, it was the existentialist philosopher Simone de Beauvoir who really kicked off the second wave of feminism with her important text, The Second Sex. The Second Sex is concerned with a common notion within both existentialist philosophy and postmodern philosophy: object versus subject. A subject is a person who has achieved self-actualization, to summarize. An object is some person or thing that, for some reason or another, has been prevented from self-actualization. Think about it this way. If you are a free person, free to pursue your life's dreams, then you have achieved subjectivity, the ability to define life as one sees fit. If, on the other hand, you are an indentured servant or a slave, you are being forcibly kept away from your ability to define your life as you see fit. You are being objectified and not being allowed to self-actualize. You are being treated as though you are no more than an object to be used by others. Simone de Beauvoir argues in The Second Sex that misogyny and patriarchal power has resulted in the objectification of women, and that the ideal response to this is to allow women the opportunity to self-actualize, to become societal subjects rather than societal objects. The book was released in 1949, so this idea was way ahead of its time in mainstream discourse, although there are definitely feminist texts before it with similar points being made. If you look at patriarchal power the way that de Beauvoir does, you can see the subject-slash-object relation pretty clearly. If men hold power over women and use it to exploit women for their own benefits, then a man is able to define his life as he sees fit, to give his life meaning. The woman in this scenario, on the other hand, is being deprived of her autonomy, of her personhood. She is an object for the man's needs, and not allowed to define her life as she sees fit. She is not being granted subjectivity. This is why I've been using the phrase patriarchal gender relations so much throughout this series and will continue to do so. Patriarchal power is the system that deprives women of their autonomy, renders them an object in the object-slash-subject dynamic. It's not a natural state of subjugation, but a socially constructed system of subjugation. This is effectively the point of Simone de Beauvoir's book, and also the point of Lynch's works a lot of the time. While Lynch most often focuses on its effects on the basic human experience of women, both in the process of being objectified and in escaping from it. Lynch explores these themes in Blue Velvet by calling attention to the way in which women are being objectified both by American society and by American media, both contemporary to the 1980s and looking back at 50s media. Lynch is challenging the objectification of women and, in a sense, demanding that they be granted societal subjectivity. The completion of women's objectification is what is explored right at the very start of Twin Peaks. Laura's death is what happens when we let patriarchal power win. This is how Twin Peaks begins to expose the flaws of 50s nostalgia and its presence in 80s television, by starting with a visual so viscerally disturbing that it forces us to ponder who could have done such a horrible thing. Then, as the series would progress, the show would eventually reveal not just those responsible for Laura's abuse and murder, but the system at play, the cultural and social issues, the way in which her murder was the product of a whole world around her, and not just one sick or depraved man. Laura's body being found is the example of the end conclusion of women's objectification. This is what patriarchal power is designed for, the complete dehumanization of women for the sake of men. Laura's body is a disturbing revelation that women, in a town like Twin Peaks and in the broader culture of the US more generally, have no autonomy, no power in society, and are deprived of their humanity in the process. This is what happens when women are nothing but object. The 1950s was an era before women pushed for the right to be treated as social subject rather than object. It's before women were seen as fully human by the system, and the resurgence in the 1980s of 50s approaches to gender suggests that they still weren't seen as fully human by the 80s. The facade of a good, simple life as seen in the town of Twin Peaks is a front for the stripping away of women's basic humanity in favor of a form of traditionalism that serves to benefit men. This theme becomes much more apparent in Fire Walk With Me, and we'll discuss it in other sections in this video as well. Laura represents not only the tension between good and evil, but her death also showcases the breaking point of a tension between 50s traditionalism and women's humanity. It's the cost of maintaining that form of traditionalism as the pristine, nostalgic gloss of the town allowed itself to obscure a form of abuse that, as early as the pilot episode, is being revealed to not just the viewers of the show, but the town themselves. The town is being forced to contend with Laura's death not just as a death unto itself, but as an exposure of the lie that the town had been living. Bobby even gives a small speech at Laura's funeral to announce this idea to the whole town. Everyone knew that something was going on with Laura, but they all did nothing, because they wanted to pretend everything was okay. They wanted to pretend that their own town was good and the people in it were good and only good things happened, even though they all knew it was a lie. It was a lie that they willed themselves into living. This small-town front of American idealism based in traditional values, Bobby's kind of calling out the town as using it to remain willfully ignorant of the reality of the situation. Bobby knows the reality because he saw both sides of Laura, and he saw both sides of the town. This willful ignorance of the violent and oppressive nature of America that is obscured by a positive image of traditionalism is something that's true of the town of Twin Peaks, but also of actual people living in the 50s at the time who were obscuring the dark side of their own culture. It was also true in the 1980s as media continued to push the narratives that the 50s had started while trying to wheel back rights for various marginalized groups. 1950s traditionalism is a bit of an existentialist crisis that was present in America during the time that Twin Peaks takes place in and in the 50s before it. Lynch uses the culture of the town of Twin Peaks to critique both 50s and 80s obsession with the days before women had autonomy. In the 50s, it was before women had power in the economy due to World War II. In the 80s, it was before women had power in the economy due to the second wave of feminism. I'll discuss this more as I discuss Cooper and Albert in a later section, but I want to say now that the two sides of Twin Peaks can be true simultaneously. The cherry pies, damn fine coffees, and long skirts of this world can be a beautiful, serene, and comforting thing, but it can't be the only part of the world you have to acknowledge. Pulling from common dualism readings of Twin Peaks, you have to take the good with the bad. You have to understand the bad in order to appreciate the good. But that's not just for its own sake. It's more politically charged than it is abstract. The good aspects of American culture can't be used to obscure the great evils within American culture. We can't just work to ignore the bad aspects of our culture. We have to fight it through conscious acknowledgement that it's there and efforts to do something about it. It's not just about seeing Dorothy Valens being held hostage. It's about doing something to make sure that these kinds of things don't happen, and remaining skeptical of the narratives that allow us to be complicit in them. It's not a fundamental rejection of all aspects of 50s traditionalism, it's skepticism of the way in which it creates a facade and obscures a dark truth underneath. Twin Peaks is more optimistic than some of Lynch's other work in this regard because it presents relationships between men and women as having potential for saving or for improving or for replacing with better relationships. The faithfulness versus infidelity aspect of Twin Peaks, which I'll discuss further in the next section, suggests that there is a more to the picture than just the choices that men are forced to make under patriarchy, but also the choices that women are forced to make, and how both gender groups can be faced with unique dilemmas, and both gender groups can navigate it in a way that shows their good heart even in the face of a somewhat cruel system. Twin Peaks continues in the same vein as Blue Velvet in its critique of patriarchal gender relations, but also explores a lot more nuance in regards to gender and provides a much more optimistic look at the relationships between men and women, as well as women's autonomy. That is to say, while similar in a few ways, Twin Peaks also stands out among Lynch's work for its unique portrayals of gender. Now let's focus on the way in which Twin Peaks portrays gender. Twin Peaks represents a bit of a turning point for Lynch as far as gender goes because it's less centered on a masculine perspective. He would continue to explore more feminine-centered perspectives in Fire Walk With Me, Mulholland Drive, and Inland Empire, but here in the original Twin Peaks, there's more of a mix of perspectives than would be present in his movies before and after. While Lynch's work even before Twin Peaks was much more sympathetic to women than a typical auteur film might be, his early work was often very male-centric, with Eraserhead, Blue Velvet, and the uncompleted project of Ronnie Rocket centering around men's perspectives and experiences. These works are gendered, and deliberately so. Eraserhead deals largely with Lynch's personal experiences with fatherhood and his anxiety around women in his early adulthood, while Blue Velvet is a critique of 1950s culture and film noir and pulls from the femme fatale trope while inverting it to humanize the woman in that archetypal role. Still, in both these films, women are the object, upon which the subject gazes, with such a gaze being deliberately a part of the themes, such as when Henry grows obsessed with his neighbor, or when Jeffrey spies on a scene of sexual violence of an attractive woman from behind a closet door. Twin Peaks marks a shift in that object had started to become subject. Women were given much more prominent roles and were characters unto themselves, not defined predominantly by men's interest in them. This came to a head with Fire Walk With Me, the first Lynch project to feature a woman protagonist and center predominantly around women's experiences. What's worth noting is that within Lynch's main works, Twin Peaks is the last time a male protagonist is both centered and positively portrayed. With the exception of Lost Highway, Dumbland, and The Return, the protagonists of Lynch's later career are almost all women, and their experiences and subjectivities become much more prominent to the point that Twin Peaks is nearly predominantly feminine, especially by contrast to Lynch's earlier career. Still, in the original run, there's a flaw in this portrayal of gender. Look at Shelley Johnson, for instance. Her relationship to Leo in Season 1 is very much focused on her perspective, such that we're looking at this relationship through Shelley's eyes first and foremost, so in this sense, it's not a masculinized story. However, Shelley is emphatically a bit of a damsel in distress, being a domestic violence victim who is rendered incapable of finding freedom except through relying on a different man, Bobby, to help her out. Similarly, Audrey is a helpless damsel in distress during the later parts of Season 1 and early parts of Season 2 to be saved by Cooper and Truman. Donna and Maddie briefly are under threat from Howard and need to be saved by James. Josie is being controlled by men in her life and in need of help from Sheriff Truman, and of course, Maddie is killed by Leland in a fit of rage upon trying to leave the town. Women are victims and women are helpless throughout Twin Peaks, which ultimately still hinges more on the influence of men, as many of the major characters are men and are the ones who save these women if they can. Similarly, usually men are the ones who victimize these women. There are examples of the contrary, such as when Catherine gets a leg up on Ben Horn by pretending to die, or how Denise plays a prominent role in FBI proceedings and helps to take out Jean Renault. Still, on average, the show portrays women as human beings and characters unto themselves, but still trapped in the traditions of media that pushes the narrative that men are their saviors, and that the fight between good and evil is the fight between two different kinds of men, with women as an object of exchange in the fight. This is why I would make the case that Twin Peaks is the last of Lynch's early career, and Fire Walk With Me is the beginning of his late career, because Fire Walk With Me is when that officially turned. Laura's story is not a story of men saving her, or of a fight between good and evil people. Laura's story is about the tragic loss of hope in a world that desperately needs it. There is no Dale Cooper to save Laura as there was to save Audrey. Laura died well before the show began, and she's going to have to die in the movie too. This inevitability could be seen as betraying my argument that Fire Walk With Me represents a turning point, but bear with me, I'll elaborate on my argument in the next video when I discuss Fire Walk With Me. The existentialist angle of becoming subject is still a theme of Twin Peaks, but Twin Peaks is not a story of empowerment, nor is it really meant to be. It's meant to be a cautionary tale about the dangers of objectifying and dehumanizing women, and of capitalist exploitation, and nostalgia for the bygone era of the 50s, and so many other things in this vein. It's just that Lynch would eventually start to shift away from women as objects towards women as subjects through the way in which he frames their perspectives and their interactions with others. Lynch, here in Twin Peaks and previously in Blue Velvet, portrays women how other artists might. It's starting with Fire Walk With Me that he starts to deconstruct this notion and present women on their own terms, even in the face of a world that seeks to objectify them. Laura is Dorothy Valens, but the film shows it from Dorothy's perspective this time instead of from Jeffrey's. Denise is a strange example of the portrayal of gender in Twin Peaks. Denise specifically emerged after Lynch left the project, but given her brief scene in The Return and the tone of that scene, it seems that Lynch was fond of this character, even if he might not have conceptualized her. In a postmodernist sense of the word, Denise's transition sort of breaks down grand narratives about gender as fixed, and specifically her backstory about deciding to transition after wearing a disguise is a very postmodern idea, and relates somewhat to the concept of gender performativity. The initial reaction to Denise in the show is a confused acceptance, but that later turns to overt acceptance in The Return as Gordon Cole speaks out on her behalf against bigotry. Denise's portrayal, as awkward as it might be in many regards, shows how Twin Peaks was in at least one way quite progressive for its time, and reminds us that the show understands that a person's subjectivity matters. This counters the grand narrative of gender that because one is born one way, that one must remain that way for the rest of their life. It's a very early 90s understanding of transgender people, but I still think it fits within the postmodern and feminist frameworks that Lynch's career gradually took on, even if he isn't the one to credit with this character. I'd at least say his active embrace of the character in The Return reflects the possibility that Lynch saw something in Denise too. I want to talk a bit more about Norma and Ed. Norma is probably the most indicative of the old 50s way of looking at gender. She's bound to her husband and remains mostly faithful, even despite Hank being a rotten husband and a rotten person generally. This is what 50s gender norms do. They bind people to their social duties even at the expense of their happiness. Traditionalism pushes Norma to unhappiness and forces her into a position where she has to make a tough decision between the tradition and her own desires. This is an extremely complicated gender representation, but it's pretty new for Lynch, and is an extension of a dilemma that TV itself was having, with numerous soap operas emphasizing the moral dimensions of faithfulness and infidelity in order to stir up drama. Twin Peaks is in many ways simply a soap opera in that regard, but applies the same modes of thinking as soap operas within the context of a broader critique of 50s nostalgia. Norma is unhappy because she's living the way that women who hold more traditional values are supposed to. She doesn't represent the feminist ideal that became prominent in the 60s and 70s, she's more in line with the good wife of days of old, but it's having an effect on her, it's making her life worse. Her attempts to be a good woman by the standards of 50s traditionalism doesn't make her bad, but it's the culture itself that is hurting her by pushing this way of living onto her, even when it clearly makes her unhappy. It's often played more for laughs with Nadine, but we do eventually see, 25 years later, Norma getting the payoff she deserves when she finally can be with Ed and not be tied to men who have control over her. It's a happy ending that I think is indicative of the themes of the show overall, and is simply delightful in its own right. Then, there's Shelley. Shelley is the victim of an abusive husband, Leo, to such a degree that it honestly crosses the line for me at times. Leo is a really, really awful man and an awful husband. It's the normativity of gender roles that 50s traditionalism encourages that leads to this scenario. Leo is granted a wife by virtue of being a man and is granted full power over his wife. Given the prevalence of domestic abuse in the 50s, Shelley showcases a different, even darker side to the way in which 50s traditionalism impacts gender roles. Shelley is bearing the brunt of a patriarchal relationship. The traditional way of living is about giving power to men to have full control over anyone within their household, most especially their wives. Shelley is completely powerless by virtue of Leo's physical strength, access to weapons that can kill her, and connections to people that can have her killed. He of course uses this power to physically assault her and to force her to do wifely duties such as laundry and other house chores. She wants to be with Bobby, but Leo is hyper-controlling. Leo is basically in a state of complete dominance over her, and this is what the front of a 50s-esque diner waitress outfit obscures. While Shelley shows up to work and puts on a smile, inside, she's being broken down by serious abuse. This culminates in the rather cathartic scene where she pulls a gun on Leo and shoots him, one of the better scenes in the first season. Twin Peaks, like Blue Velvet before it, showcases abusive power dynamics between men and the women they control, and then showcases the effect it's having on the woman in question. The two also show that there is a way out. Twin Peaks takes it an extra step further and focuses on the emotional and social dilemmas that women in powerless positions face, and then also shows ways in which these women navigate these positions in order to find small pieces of happiness, and then ultimately, how they defy these roles and try to take back power to be themselves. In the object-subject relationship, the show gives us a view of the internal conflicts of being treated as an object and the ways in which people can reclaim their subjectivity and fight for it. And that's a wonderful thing, even in spite of some darker edges that can make the show an uncomfortable watch at times. Obviously, in addition to women, men are also a gendered group of people, and in terms of portrayal of masculinity, Twin Peaks is necessarily less extreme than Blue Velvet by simple virtue of television rules for violence and extreme content. Needless to say, we don't get someone as rotten as Frank Booth. That said, Twin Peaks is still critical of a lot of masculinity, particularly as it relates to exploitation of local communities and of women from men with power. The obvious example is Ben and Jerry Horn, who run a brothel that includes underage girls and even sleep with the girls themselves. There's also Leo, who is in business with Ben and, in addition to helping run drugs across the border and sell drugs, also abuses his wife, Shelley. There's Hank, who seems to work for whoever will pay him, and is also implicated in Ben's plotting. There's the Renaults, who reap the benefits of one-eyed Jacks in both drugs and girls. There's Bobby and his friend Mike, who, despite being in high school, regularly avoid high school responsibilities to involve themselves in the drug ring via Leo, and Bobby is conspiring with Shelley to kill Leo and later to try to extort Ben Horn for money. The most obvious example, though, is Leland. Leland is abusing and raping his own daughter, and eventually kills both her and Maddie, and has previously killed Teresa Banks, who it's revealed in Fire Walk With Me was also an underage sex worker. Importantly, Leland is also Ben's lawyer and is implicated in Ben's corruption and allows himself to reap the benefits of Ben's exploitation of the local town and its people. Then, finally, there's Bob. Bob is some kind of spirit of great evil and is portrayed specifically as a masculine spirit, a man with the name of Bob. Judy, a spirit we see much later in The Return, is gendered feminine, but has a very androgynous appearance, not appearing to have an obvious physiology or gender, and even Judy's name is a mispronunciation of a previous name. So in this sense, Bob is specifically gendered masculine, and as a source of the greatest evil in the original show, his existence as a man terrorizing the town is in part metaphorical for the dark influences of masculine forces on the town. I hate to say it, but Bob sort of represents toxic masculinity in a way, in that he's the dark side of masculinity that allows men who might otherwise be good to do horrible, horrible things. He corrupts men just like hegemonic masculinity does. But to contrast this, there are also many positive portrayals of masculinity. First, there's Sheriff Truman, a man who looks out for others and always does the right thing according to what he believes to be righteous. He knows his town and he cares for it, and he keeps his eyes peeled for corruption and tries to put a stop to it. He's a cop that genuinely cares, which is, rare as far as real life is concerned. Then there's Albert, who, even despite his pessimistic and snarky demeanor, speaks out in favor of pacifism and idolizes Gandhi and Martin Luther King and believes in loving his fellow human beings no matter what. He also is a great forensics guy and has passion for his job despite his flaws. There's also Ed, who chooses to remain faithful to Nadine even despite being in love with Norma, because he knows better than to break Nadine's heart and still respects her even if his heart belongs to someone else. He sticks by principles that require a lot of personal sacrifice for that of another, and even though the show is rife with affair after affair, Ed is one of the few that chooses to remain faithful. There's also James, perhaps the one person close to Laura who actually had a good heart and knew how to show it, and throughout the show he remains a decent-hearted boy who tries to treat others with respect and is willing to accept accountability for his mistakes. There's Gordon, Pete, Andy, Huck, hell, even Dick Tremaine. Even Bobby himself has a good streak in him, even as he involved himself in a bad life. The show is not utterly devoid of positive examples of men. The big one, of course, is Dale Cooper. Cooper knows how to tune into the feelings of people around him, respects local customs and culture, and believes in intuition even despite logic being centered in masculine modes of thinking. Cooper turns down Audrey because he knows better than to be like the kinds of people at One-Eyed Jack's, and he remains set on his mission of helping bring closure to the case of Laura Palmer, not just for him, but for the many people in this town. Cooper is one of the best portrayals of a man in basically anything I've ever seen. This is why The Return contrasts so hard with the original show and might even be off-putting for many viewers. I'll discuss why I think The Return's more morally ambiguous portrayal of Cooper was for the best when I get to The Return, but for now I'll say that a lot changed between 1990 and 2017, for the world, for Lynch as an artist and as a person, and for media and culture generally. Cooper's boyish optimism, charm, and perceptive heroic deeds made sense in a world where men were the subject and women the object. After Fire Walk With Me, after the 21st century, after the major shift towards prestige television, after the awful nightmare that was the 2016 election, and in a world where the Me Too movement was shortly to spread, the kinds of male heroism that we see more often in 90s media would be antiquated both politically and artistically, and necessarily, The Return had to address this concern in some way. We'll get to how it does that when we get there. What's interesting is that, just like with the women in the show and just like Blue Velvet and Eraserhead before, Twin Peaks carries on in the tradition of Lynch's early career of a strong moral dilemma that men are faced with when it comes to how they relate to women. On the exploitative side, you get Leo, Ben, Leland, but on the non-exploitative side, you get Dale, Andy, Truman, Ed. These men are also faced with similar moral dilemmas about faithfulness, duties as men, and how they relate to women more generally. Dale is tempted to be with Audrey because of Audrey's advances towards him, a subplot that honestly probably shouldn't have happened. But Dale's refusal showcases his good nature and his ability to understand that he needs to see women as equals and not as existing solely for his benefit. He may find her attractive, but he makes the good decision not to take advantage of her. This gets a bit retconned in The Return in order to make the same point, that if Dale were to get with Audrey, it would be at best morally ambiguous, at worst exploitative. Ed is tempted to leave Nadine, who is, all things considered, a very fragile woman. Because of his good nature, he knows better than to break Nadine's heart, and as a result, willingly lives in a loveless marriage for over 30 years, even as he sees the woman he loves on a daily basis, Norma. Ed is bound to similar norms of fidelity as Norma, and it's framed as what makes him honorable. Andy later, sometime into season 2, becomes invested in the potential to be father to Lucy's child, which, as cutesy and corny of a subplot as it is indicative of Andy trying to fit into a role as an effort to be not just a good person, but a good man, a good father. The point being that these good men aren't good simply because they are written to be seen as good. They are faced with similar moral dilemmas as women and choose the route of being caring about women's needs, emotions, livelihood, well-being, and humanity. Ed recognizes Nadine as a human being, and this is why, 25 years later, Nadine lets Ed go amicably and happily. Because Nadine's happiness had been fulfilled by recognizing that someone cared about her so deeply and saw her as a human being. She later found her own happiness without needing to rely on Ed. Effectively, egalitarian relationships is the end goal of a lot of Lynch's work when it comes to gender and romance, falling within the same ways of thinking as de Beauvoir's reading. Women need to be equal human beings in society and in interpersonal relationships with men in order for the world to be good. The good people are good because they work towards a world where every life is sacred, where a life is still a life. They live the ideal that draws Cooper to Twin Peaks. It's a system, a culture that makes good people live hard lives and makes bad people the beneficiaries. Twin Peaks, like most of Lynch's work, goes against the culture of patriarchy in order to suggest that goodness is fostered by goodness, and evilness is fostered by evilness. When the system promotes exploitative behaviors, it fosters evil and makes goodness harder to accomplish. In the next section, we'll jump ahead to Season 2 and discuss the major episode that demonstrates this point, Episode 14, Lonely Souls.